Welcome to the Worldly Wellbeing Podcast. I'm Holly.
And I'm Luke.
We invite guests on this podcast to explore themes of worldly wellbeing. And by listening today, you're joining the conversation.
Today's episode was recorded with Andrew Cunning, who's based in Belfast in Northern Ireland. I've been familiar with Andrew's work for a little while and was really looking forward to getting stuck into this episode with him. It's a really juicy conversation, so we hope you enjoy it. Hi, Andrew. Lovely to see you.
Hi, Luke. Hi, Holly. It is lovely to be with you.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you for joining us all the way from...
sunny-ish, South Belfast in Northern Ireland. We had almost a flood yesterday, but today is relatively sunny. So I'm in a little apartment in the south of Belfast.
Wow. Lovely. With almost biblical weather.
Well, I was going to say, we had biblical wind yesterday.
Yesterday was terrifying. I was in Sainsbury's and people were gathering at the entrance because they were terrified of the judgment of the Lord.
It's like an Irish apocalyptic scene. So before we delve too much deeper into that, Andrew, would you be so kind as to introduce yourself and maybe say a little bit about what you do?
Yeah, sure. I was asked to introduce myself on Monday night, and I struggle with the word theologian, which is what I'm encouraged to call myself, because it either raises expectations or drastically lowers them to depend on who you're talking to. So I am a theologian by training. I have a PhD in English literature and theology, and published a book on the theologian Marlon Robinson a couple of years ago. So I'm growing more comfortable with that awful word theologian. It's much easier to call yourself a teacher or a writer, but I'm leaning into theologian because the people who get to call themselves theologians dominate. So yes, I grew up in Northern Ireland, and I am doing my work, which is public theology in the main, within the island of Ireland, because there is not a huge amount of public theology beyond street preaching and what you might expect public theology in Northern Ireland to look like. So that's what I'm trying to do and have been doing for the last few years.
Fab. So if it's not street preaching or anything else, what exactly could you give us a little tidbit as to what that looks like? Well,
I'm sitting in a place that's so incredibly binaried, if that's a word.
It is now.
It is now. And Christianity here is increasingly binaried. It used to be Catholic Protestant, and now the big divide seems to me to be conservative, traditional, and progressive liberal. And my work began in the sort of progressive liberal tradition that's emerging here, and then increasingly is getting trying to be a bit beyond the binary, not in the middle of it, but beyond it, to try and see past, try and go beneath it maybe rather than beyond it, to see the Christianity that lies at its root. So I find myself not having many friends because I argue with the progressives and the liberals as much as I do with the conservatives, and I tend to agree with the conservatives often enough about their criticism of the progressives, even if I don't share their sort of political conclusions. So that's what it looks like. And a lot of the time it's just going back to texts to reread. And I do an awful lot of facilitation work with getting people just to read again, because quite often we bring our political opinions to the text and just make it say what we want. So a lot of my work begins there, going back to the words on the page. That's why I went into literature. It's an easy way to get people around a table, not to shout at one another.
Before we just go any further, I just wanted to say, Andrew, I do love an analogy, and I love baked goods. And I was kind of thinking, when you said you feel like you're in between the two groups, you're kind of like a Jammy Dodger, really. You're the jam, which is actually the best bit. And you're also like a little Jammy Dodger. You know how the jam's kind of peeking through one end? That's you. You're infiltrating as well.
That's a lovely analogy. It runs the risk of making me seem like a sort of jam-based liberal Democrat, though, caught in between. I like to be beneath or above the Jammy Dodger rather than stuck in the middle of it.
Do you know, we can work on this. But I just want to be a hobnob.
Oh, that is an excellent choice. Also, the way that your mind works, Holly, it's like how on earth did a Jammy Dodger spring? It's so abstract. I mean, I can't remember the last time I even saw a Jammy Dodger, and yet that is where your mind went to. It's a work of art. It's beauty.
We don't. It's best really not to question where my mind goes.
Yeah. So, Andrew, you mentioned that your PhD is in theology and literature. I mean, when I talk in, whether it's in public context or in kind of training that I deliver, I often kind of caveat my qualifications with they're slightly useless beyond the realms of what the kinds of things that I talk about. So, I haven't quite managed to make myself subject myself maybe to a PhD just yet. But my master's is in biblical studies. And my undergraduate is in theology, which, you can make a joke that says, actually, in the real world, they're not that useful. But my sense is actually that there is some use to them, and that perhaps the work that you're doing draws out that use. And I'm wondering if there's something that you could talk about around there about the impact of the kind of study that you have done and continue to do in a lived out way that is beneficial to local community.
So to start with the question of usefulness, this is something I tell students all the time, that the act of studying literature or theology is already a countercultural thing to do because it has no predetermined use. It's not useful at all. You're not going to immediately go and solve problems in the workplace with you'll have to do some extra work to make that fit the workplace. And that's why literature and theology and history are profoundly in themselves. The study of them is a critique of our culture that sees everything as only having value if it's useful, if it has an immediate application. And these things don't. And it kind of points up how for the last 3,000 years, the last, say, 500 years, we've started to think of things as value in terms of their usefulness. I think before that, things were ends in themselves. Things were useful because they got us deeper into thought rather than leaving our bodies, which and becoming workers. So I tell my students that all the time. This is not useful, and in that way, it's incredibly beneficial. But theology has a huge impact. It's very hard. I get frustrated with people who get interested in things that I think have no meaning. I was overhearing a conversation today about buying property, and these people spoke for an hour about buying property. And I think, you're going to be dead in 40, 50 years. And that if that's the depth you're prepared to reach, that seems like a life half lived. So studying theology immerses you in the big questions that have bothered us for 4,000 years. It doesn't implicate you in any kind of answer. You don't have to believe certain things to do theology, but it does invite you to ask the questions. And it's kind of that thing, would you rather be a pig satisfied or Socrates dissatisfied, that old philosophical thing. It invites you into an awful lot of unhappiness because you start to see things the way they are. But I find that that's a great agitation for change, to want to change things, is to delve into those foundational, soily questions about why things are the way they are. So that's why literature and theology will always be part of what I do, even though I can't make any money out of it, as I'm discovering.
Yeah. And I think that's what you've just picked on, something really kind of tangible for Holly and I when we've been kind of exploring conversations through this podcast, but also in our own kind of explorations of the world and how we experience it and what we think about it. The more you begin to unpack things, the more questions you ask, the more you kind of try to break apart the rationale, the system that's been kind of set. Yeah. The more you can sit there thinking, wow, this is actually quite challenging. Wow, this this is hard to process. The whole pig happy, Socrates unhappy thing. I'd not heard that before, but it is that sense of actually some days you can have this overwhelming sense of everything is really broken and I don't have any answers to that. I just know that the more I learn, the more I realize things are broken.
Yes, yeah. And I was teaching a course last Wednesday, and I started, the course is an introduction to theological thinking. And I started by saying that the purpose of this is not to answer your questions, it's to learn to ask better questions. That's the end product. You might be left with your question, but it won't bother you as much because now you've got a better one. That's the goal of theology, is to reframe the questions, to constantly be asking the better ones. And quite often people who reject theology, on the face of it, are asking questions that are rubbish. Like, does God exist? Is a boring question, but what does it mean if God does exist? What might that mean is a much more interesting question and gets you beyond true and false. So yes, I totally agree. I think Marlon Robinson says something like, to conclude is not in the nature of the enterprise. So we're not aiming to conclude, we're aiming to keep a conversation going, which is so much more human.
I presume then that in the work that you do, this whole idea of kind of questioning and exploring means that there isn't someone who has all the answers or someone who is necessarily right or wrong, because so often I think we kind of speak to someone because we're going to trust what they say because we want an answer or we want guidance. And actually, sometimes I just laugh because I think, do you know what? Do you think everyone in this planet is just blagging their way through? Is that what we're all doing? But there are some of us, sometimes we feel like people are correct or incorrect or have information or don't, whereas actually maybe we're all just people trying to figure it out.
I think so. Part of the way we determine what we think is true is based on who we like. And if we like a person, then what they say is true. And we would rather a familiar lie than an unfamiliar truth. And we deceive ourselves in thinking that we're after the truth. Really, we're after connection. And if someone we want to connect with is saying something outrageous, we'll make excuses for them and try and make them more palatable. We look what happened in American politics with Trump. A lot of people who shouldn't support Trump ended up supporting Trump, despite all the lies he told. But there's so many of those thinking traps that we fall into. We are much happier just believing the same stuff that the people we are with believe than not. So I think we're not as dispassionate as we think we are. And for me, the question's not really about truth, because a lot of the big ultimate questions we'll never know if we're right or not. But what we can question is ethics. Is it the right thing to do? Is that the right way to behave? You can get much closer to that, I think, or make a case for it, but we'll never know whether God exists or whether free will exists, all these sort of big questions that keep us up at night. And I think theology has a lovely way of shifting the conversation away from truth to ethics. But that's only if theology is in the right hands. Quite often we leave the ethics at the door and we only care about the truth, which ironically then leads to really bad ethics.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying there about truth and the kind of almost that you're articulating what an echo chamber is, and how we've touched on this in other episodes. I think when we spoke to Brandon Robertson, we touched on this a little bit, and also with Alice in Albania, and probably with others, it's a common theme. But this idea of we information is curated, truth is curated for us based on what we've previously interacted with. And we're either intentionally doing that by following certain people on social media or selecting certain news publications to read and not reading others. Or it's being done for us based on algorithms and, we've noticed that your patterns of behavior look like X. So we're going to keep pushing you down and you're going to keep then liking the same things. You're going to keep engaging with the same thing. It's confirmation bias. It's going to keep affirming what you already believe. And I suppose my thinking and listening to what you're saying, I'm wondering if you agree with this. There's a role for theology, the kind of process of critical theology, critical discussion, in dismantling that slightly or entirely. And it's okay to go in and challenge something and not come away having resolved it.
I think so. I think good theology always has a place for mystery, which is something that we don't have in the 21st century, a place for nuance and complexity. Now, when I say theology, I don't mean theology as a whole, because theology, like any other human project, has the same problems as anything else, and a lot of the theologians don't do it well. But the best theologies have such a room for the unknown. There's a Greek word, apophasis, which means negation or negative. And that's a whole branch within theology from the mystics to say that we can't say anything true about God. So we either don't talk at all or we speak in paradoxes. And to bring that to the table in the 21st century is quite nice whenever everything is neatly defined into systems and binaries. You're either this or this. Again, that's not to say that we need to be in the middle, but we just have to have room for the thing we don't know. And that's something theology is really good at. Something that science, it's interesting that theology is distinct from science in that science thinks there's something we don't know and we'll find it out. Theology has always said there's something we don't know and it can't be known. which keeps you humble, or should keep you humble, because if it's true about that, it could be true about this. There's something here that we don't know, and it never can. So then we get to the text, and the whole point of reading together is not to get to the truth, but is to build a community around something we don't understand. But so often Christian history is, let's just set up a new church because I don't like what they said. We need to be a Methodist, we need to be a Baptist, we need to be a Unitarian because we didn't like that bit. But that's we come from the Jewish faith, which is they just fight about text all the time and stay friends, which is something that the Christian tradition has completely forgotten about how to disagree well, about stuff they ultimately don't have a clue about.
You're based in Northern Ireland where you're working and living. Could you, I think it would be helpful for probably Luke and I as well as other listeners, could you just tell us a little bit what it's like to be living in Northern Ireland at the moment? What's the situation like?
It's so hard to talk about because it's like asking a fish to talk about its water. I don't know what's distinctive about it because I've been here for almost 30 years. At the minute, tensions are a little bit higher than they have been in the last 15 years, for sure. Whenever I was 6 months old, the IRA blew up my hometown at the centre of Coleraine. And that was my only encounter with what became known as the Troubles in 1992. But since 1998, the Good Friday Agreement, things have largely been a little bit better. But recently, with the dreaded B word, Brexit, things have been a little unstable. There's rumours of borders on the Irish Sea and then on the island of Ireland, which two distinct groups don't want for different reasons. And I had an office on a road called the Donegal Road in Belfast, and that is where the riots started a few months ago. Unionist loyalists came out to riot to protest against the protocol. So that was the first real large-scale set of violent nights we've had in a long time, and it was about 5 minutes from where I live, where things were being thrown over peace walls, which are sort of the last remaining pieces of infrastructure from the Troubles to separate Catholics and Protestants, essentially, Unionists and Nationalists. So buses were burned and drivers were kicked off buses, and you saw all that stuff on the news. So it's an interesting place to be, but I sometimes get annoyed with people who aren't from here calling this place dangerous. It's not. I could walk anywhere at any time, largely, in the same way that you could in Birmingham or London or wherever, any city. But what is interesting is how attentive you are, how hypervigilant you are about language and names and accents, and how politically weighted they are. So when you meet someone new and their name is Kiva, you've already made your assumption that this person wants United Ireland. They've gone to a Catholic school. They're probably not a Catholic anymore in terms of going to Mass. But they probably have a certain politics. And then you have William, who's also come into the room. And William, Billy, however he wants to be known, did not go to Catholic school. He went somewhere else. So all these little micro signifiers, Irish on street signs, and then you go to another neighbourhood and there's no Irish on the street signs. How you say the letter H, is it H or H, reveals an awful lot about your background. So these little things that no one else understands unless you're from here are little clues as to, are you them or us?
And so your work in kind of the kind of theological and sort of spaces involving literature, it sounds like often is encouraging, prodding, nurturing, poking people to kind of start breaking down those binaries and start exploring beyond the kind of status quo, the binaried nature of things. How does that look like? What does that look like in a context that is, from an external perspective, quite binary? We the little that we're taught about Northern Ireland, this side of the Irish Sea, and as you referred to the Troubles in inverted commas, we're not really taught about that. So the little that we learn is, it's one side versus that side. And the reasoning is very, very simple. It's, for these reasons and only these reasons. And obviously nothing is ever quite that simple. But I wonder, your work, how does that, and the way that you approach your work, what does that look like in what can be quite a binary context?
I teach a little workshop around reading that gets us, and I use the Bible because it's a shared language between Catholics and Protestants. Although I find Northern Catholics aren't as familiar with the Bible as Northern Protestants. Northern Protestants are very big on the Bible. But I start that workshop by saying that we all have have a rhythm of reading or a favored lens by which we approach things. So I artificially disrupt that for them and say, you're going to read with, I'm going to give you a key word and you're going to read with that in mind, just to get out of your own head for a second. So we do that with 7 or 8 different words. And then I say, well, what we could do is take away those words and substitute them for people's names. So when I say read this passage with liberation in mind, read this passage with law in mind, read this passage with social media in mind, what I could be asking you to do is, what might Siobhan say about this passage? What might John say about this passage? Just to try and develop a little bit of empathy through reading. Because if you try and get people, myself included, to do that without a text in the middle, without the buffer, we lean away. Whereas to read together means that we lean in to discover together. And it's that place, not in the middle of the binary, but beyond the binary that we're trying to get to. There's a lovely quote that I've been working with this week. I'm going to actually see if, no, it's not going to be pulled up, by Krista Tippett. You know, Krista Tippett hosts the On Being podcast. Mm-hmm. She says, I can disagree with your political and religious opinions, but what I can't disagree with is your experience. Once you've told me your experience of something, then you and I are in relationship. And while we still disagree, our disagreement doesn't define what is possible between us anymore. So we still belong to that binary, but we can start to see a space that's above it that we can meet at while still retaining our deeply held. That's the thing, because we're not trying to change people's minds about the border. And I think a lot of peace work was trying to soften people's opinions about the border. But rather, we want people to believe what they want, but still be able to do community well. And that's the really tricky bit. And yeah, there are people far better at that than I am.
And actually, now I see your point about my Jammy Dodger, Andrew, because I think there is something quite different to, rather than finding a space in the middle, sort of suggesting that there's a sense of compromise from either side, but you're meeting in a space above, which isn't attached necessarily. You can't necessarily see the limits of that. And it's somewhere where, yeah, people, you can still be yourselves. It's not saying you have to renounce like your belief or whatever your opinion is, but I like that idea of sort of almost just rising above. And it's a little bit like, when my mum used to say to me, rise above it, Holly, when my brother was being really annoying.
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, I still found him annoying, but I didn't need to react in a certain way.
Yeah. And the thing is, to do that well, both people need to feel safe. There's no way you're going to meet someone, encounter someone properly if you feel that they're going to disembowel you, metaphorically or literally. Like, we recently got a cat, and it took the kitten 2 days before he lay on his back and showed you his belly so you could give him a belly scratch. I just think that's what we all want to do. We all want to lie on our backs, but we're so on guard. And you can only ever do it when you feel safe, when you feel the other person isn't going to maul you when you sleep.
Yeah, and I think that's partly the problem with discourse now, conversation now, because it is so polarized. You're either us or you're them. You are constant, particularly in online spaces. Everything is so volatile, and everything descends a lot of things. Don't want to be quite so sweeping in what I'm saying. A lot of things can descend into, an attack. If you don't think like this, if you don't agree with me here, then you must be an X. You must be wrong. You must hate all people. But this idea of stepping back from that made me think of the work of a guy called Charles Eisenstein, who I'm reading a lot at the moment. He's based in the US, and he's been kind of riffing on the Buddhist idea of interbeing, which actually there's a number of faiths would actually find a lot of similarity and find a lot of home ground in that, even within Christianity. But he argues that we're moving out of this age of separation, which, as Andrew, you referenced the last sort of 500 years, and I would say the last 100 years or so, where technology has improved our lives in inverted commas in so many ways, is also encouraged us to be very separate. We're now moving out of that phase and into a phase of interbeing and connectivity. And trying to now find, kind of talking about what you were just referencing, our feet again in how we can communicate, still keep hold of our beliefs, still keep hold of how we identify, but how we can recognize each other's common humanity.
Yeah, I think I wrote something down before we came on the podcast, which is really close to that. The divisions that we invent, whether they be Northern Irish or whatever, are superficial, which doesn't mean that they're not real, but they betray the reality, as you say, that the being itself is what unites us. The fact, existence unites us, and that we're literally made of the same stuff. But then that turns into sometimes this sort of rubbish, diluted liberal thing of saying, well, we're all the same. If you cut me, do I not bleed? I think that sort of trying to paper over the cracks of difference is so rubbish. You become more yourself when you become more yourself and less, and not more like everyone else. So I think Presbyterians should be very Presbyterian and Catholics should be very Catholics and Muslims should be Muslim. And then that way we discover our common humanity, not by leaving all that behind and meeting in the middle, but becoming more specific. There's this, one of my favorite theologians, he probably isn't even a theologian, Ralph Waldo Emerson, 19th century American thinker, says that people think that travel solves everything. If you go to Egypt or Beirut or wherever, that will broaden your horizons. And yeah, largely. But he said, and I'm paraphrasing mightily here, if you're an asshole in New England, you're going to be an asshole in Belfast. So become more yourself, attend to yourself. There is a universal humanity, but you'll only recognize that whenever you get in touch with who you are. And sorry, one thing that you said that sparked me, the whole online stuff, that Twitter is the most, for my money, disembodied place imaginable. And it's no coincidence that such a disembodied form produces such vitriolic, evil responses to people, because you can only be that cruel when you're just talking to digits on a screen or to an avatar. And the theology keeps, the central Christian idea is incarnation, is calling us back to bodies. It's not calling us away. And social media has that opposite pull. We become completely cerebral, completely intellectualized. You are your opinions. You're not a body anymore. You're just what you think. It's the whole Descartes. I think, therefore I am. I think, therefore I exist. I have opinions, therefore I matter. And theology has the opposite pull, which I think my generation have totally missed out on as the Twitter generation.
Am I right in getting from that we have a two-stage thing of reconnecting with ourselves to make sure that what we're working on or who we're trying to build up is behaving? Is that correct? The behaving in the kind of way that is true to ourselves, that we should, in a way that we should be, before being secure enough to connect with others who have different opinions? I mean, have I just completely simplified that into a really not correct way?
Well, no, I think that's spot on. I had a conversation with someone last week, and they said they were at a gig for the first time in about a year and a half, and they said it was amazing. It really took me out of myself for an hour and a half. And I went away thinking, that doesn't feel right. And then I thought, no, it didn't do that. So we met up again. It didn't take you out of yourself. It took you back into yourself. That's so often people go to religion or to mushrooms or LSD or whatever to get out of themselves. But what's really happening is they're actually getting, for the first time in a while, they're being back in their bodies. That's what transcendence is wrongly named. We think we're transcending our brains, but in reality, our brains or our minds are coming back in touch with our own rhythm, because we equate life, with just behind our own eyes, because that's the Western way. The body is something we have to lumber with. We have to just carry about from moment to moment, but really we're just brains and minds. So this notion of getting beyond ourselves is actually, it's getting into ourselves.
Yeah, and I think that's why, and if you are playing yoga bingo with Luke, then this is where you get your prize, because there's me mentioning yoga again. But this is why, the yogic principles really have resonated with me, particularly this past year, is that it is about being in your body. It's not about finding some spiritual plane in which you're meditating upon a cloud, but rather finding something more about yourself within yourself, very physically on the mat. And this principle of filling up your cup before you go out and fill up others. We need to work on ourselves physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, before we can enter into these conversations, these dialogues, these spaces in which we're encouraged to interact with the other. And I think more and more people are waking up to that. My sense is that there is a movement towards recognizing, whether that's through mindfulness or meditation or, eating better or going for a walk every day. More and more people are waking up to the fact that this element of inward care, self-care, I don't like that expression, but this idea of mindfully tending to oneself is needed. And I think we have lost sight of that as a species collectively, but there is a shift towards reconnecting with that, which I find I find quite profoundly exciting. Like on the days where I'm feeling a bit low and a bit like, oh gosh, like humanity's doomed. Actually, I'm like, no, there is a shift. There is movement towards the recognition of self, that embodied self.
Yeah.
And that's why I do cling on to my faith, because partly because of the incarnation. Christmas is my favorite celebration when it comes to the Christian church. And that partly is because I love like Christmas decorations and I love Christmas food. I got married at Christmas time. Like it is the best time. It literally is the most wonderful time of the year. But also because the incarnation is the most profound, like for me, the most profound thing. And I could wax lyrical about that for days. So I'm going to stop there. But there is this sense of the embodiment. There is power to that. And there are so many groups that have been marginalized because we've tried to take that embodiment away from them, whether they're Black or whether they're queer, women. When we strip people's embodiedness away from them, we're doing great harm.
And I guess that is the perfect example of that vulnerability that inevitably comes from that relationship with self, but can be used really powerfully.
Yes, and I think rest and restoration and self-knowledge are obviously really key, but something even just as important is to process your pain before you go and do something. So many people save the world out of a wound, or try to save the world out of a wound, and then end up creating the same thing again that will hurt other people. So while rest and things are really like absolutely crucial, to sit with the reason you want to change the world and make sure that it's your own and not because you've been hurt. Being hurt is a good reason, but it needs to be dealt with before you go and scheme. Because it will always be coming out of a place of a no rather than a yes, which is, hurt people, I think.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if we could just flit back to the sessions that you were talking about, and where you're using literature, and specifically was the Bible or a book and the act of reading as that sort of tool with which to explore these things. Why do you think it is that reading with others has this potential, this ability to make it happen?
Well, there's a few answers to that. I get so excited about this because I think reading is so exciting because it takes us into what we're actually made of. So that sounds a bit metaphysical and weird. But I think the Bible is a collection of stories, and I think I'm a collection of stories. I might be more than that, but at root, I think I'm a collection of stories, which is why we're also terrified of Alzheimer's and dementia, because that our personhood, we feel, is under threat when we start to lose our stories. But that doesn't get rid of the stories that people tell about us either. But I think part of what we are is, in some sense, a collection of stories that we tell ourselves. And I happen to be the main character in all of them. Which is why I there's a brilliant video. The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. Have you ever heard of that?
No.
Oh, you're going to love this. So this guy, or it might be a team, but it's only a guy that I know, decided to invent words into the English language that to invent words for experiences that we have that we lack the words for. And he invented the word sonder. I made this beautiful video that I've used about 100 times when I teach. And sonder means the realization that everyone else is as complex as you are. And he uses these lovely little examples, saying things like, you were the lit window of the hotel room that someone saw on the way past, or you were the car that was being waved at from someone in the airplane, and the people in the coffee shop, you're their backdrop. You don't matter. It's really moving. Like, people often cry when they watch this video because they realize that, no, I'm part of a thing here. I'm not Brad Pitt. So reading brings us into that. First of all, to what we are. We are it's kind of a physical manifestation of what we are. And the second thing is it is when you read, it's the only time most Westerners ever have to listen without interrupting. Because you can't interrupt the author. You can set the book down, but you can't interrupt them. To read is to be genuinely empathetic. You have to sit there and be and take it in. And you're only offered the world through the perspective that you're handed. And that is often a new perspective, which is why reading is always so educational, or often educational and really exciting. So yeah, those are some of the reasons why I think reading is fundamental.
That's really interesting. I've actually sneakily, I don't know if you guys noticed, had a quick Google on my phone for that book. So we'll definitely, pop that. But actually, you've mentioned a lot of really great people and quotes that I think we'll try and pop those in the show notes as well for people to go back and look into in their own time as well.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously links to the work that you're doing as well, Andrew. I feel like what I need to do is probably jump on the next flight to Belfast and just sit in a really nice coffee shop somewhere and just talk with you for hours, because I could just keep going. And the way that I talk as well, it does rabbit on and on. But I think it's probably a good point to say thank you for your time and your energy in contributing to the Wildly Wellbeing podcast today. You've opened up, I'm sure, doors of thought for people in really accessible ways. And it's been a really beautiful conversation. So thank you for that.
No, thank you. I didn't know what we were going to end up talking about. So I was surprised as much as anyone. So I'm glad it was so fun.
Yeah, this has been really wonderful. Thank you, Andrew. I've got a lot to go away and think about myself, which I always love.
Yeah, and I've already preloaded that video, that I think the video that you were just referencing, Andrew. So that's immediately what my homework is going to be.
Yeah, so brilliant. So brilliant.
Cool. Well, thank you so much. And I will look forward to speaking to you some more soon.
Yes, absolutely. Let's do it. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so one thing we have definitely learned is it is time for a cup of tea and cake for Holly.
I definitely need some caffeination, mostly to fuel activity that is going to involve watching some of those videos that Andrew mentioned and researching half the names that he mentioned, because they all sound incredible and like the kind of people that I want to read more about.
Yeah, I absolutely love it when not only do I come away buzzing from a conversation, feeling like I've learned something, but also feeling like I have sneaky, inadvertent homework.
Yeah, there was a bit of like under the radar, I'm going to go away and learn some more. Now, you kind of think if teachers did that in school, everyone would be far more willing to do their homework.
Honestly, I can see why he is great in his teaching role, because that was really sneaky.
It was, but it was a really fascinating conversation, and I genuinely want to kind of keep that going with Andrew, and really just keep exploring some of those themes. And as we mentioned in the recording, I think it's so important to keep fostering that dialogue. First of all, to keep working on ourselves, but then to keep creating those spaces. And I think that's what we're trying to do here with the Wildly Wellbeing podcast, is creating those spaces to engage in that conversation.
Yeah, we're doing that floating above into that little neutral zone up above, where we can just have those conversations and have that backwards and forwards.
Floating above the Jammy Dodger.
Exactly. We're going above the Jammy Dodger. And there was something else I wanted to say that's totally gone from my mind. Oh, yeah. And off camera, off microphone, we have officially invited ourselves to Ireland.
Yeah, when we finished recording, did suggest to Andrew that a visit might be in order, so we can continue our conversation over probably caffeinated beverages and cake, because that continues to be a recurrent theme.
Exactly. But in the meantime, don't you worry, we will be back next week. If you are itching at the bit, is that the expression?
No, and that sounds absolutely foul. Why is your bit itching? Chomping at the bit.
Raring at the bit.
Chomping at the bit.
Chomping. If you are chomping at the bit to know who we are speaking to next week, we're not going to tell you. Instead,
we are going to there's also sneaky going on, sneakily signpost you to our brand spanking new Instagram page that we are lovingly nurturing into existence. And each week we will be giving you a little heads up as to the guests that we're inviting on the next week. So you can find us on Instagram with @WildlyWellbeing.
It still feels unnatural not to try to spell out our very complex old Instagram handles.
It does. You can still find us if you want to, but we'll let you do that yourselves.
Yeah. So don't forget to check out our website and our Instagram. And if you feel like it, leave us a little message or a like.
Indeed. And also enjoy the newly revamped website. We're going to mention this a few times because we're very proud of it. And we're very grateful to another Andrew Hankinson, for creating our new logo. It's very swish, it's very shiny. And so we'll keep mentioning and dropping that into conversation so you can check out all of the exciting new things that we as the Wildly Wellbeing team are up to.
Oh, team, you make us sound very official.
So profesh.
So in the meantime, we wish you joy, happiness, and a little bit of homework.
Yeah, sending you lots of love and peace.
Ciao for now.